The dust of the Redemption Town Square hung thick and acrid, each particle a testament to broken dreams and the parched hopes of its inhabitants. It clung to the worn skirts of the women and the sweat-stained hats of the men, a gritty shroud over a community gathered not for celebration, but for the grim spectacle of human desperation. At the center of this grim tableau, on the raw timber steps of the Mercantile, stood Jedediah Thorne, a man whose tailored suit seemed an affront to the town's general decay, his belly full and his eyes gleaming with a possessor's cruel light. Before him, Ilara, a woman whose beauty was eroded by hunger and fear, not by years, knelt in the dirt. Her 2 children, a boy with eyes too old for his 6 years and a girl of 5 who clutched a faceless corn-husk doll, pressed against her sides, their small bodies trembling like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. Thorne's voice, awed with self-satisfaction, cut through the uneasy silence. "The debt is due, Ilara. The magistrate has ruled. Your late husband's folly is now your burden." He gestured vaguely towards her, as if she were another piece of property to be inventoried. "The shack, the barren plot of land, it's all mine. And you," his gaze lingered, "you have nothing left to offer. Or do you?" A low, suggestive chuckle rumbled in his chest, drawing a few nervous titters from the sycophants at his flank. Ilara's head was bowed, her dark hair falling to hide her face, but her shoulders, though thin, did not slump in complete defeat. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, yet it carried across the unnatural hush that had fallen. "There is nothing." Nothing, but as she raised her head then, and her eyes, clear despite the terror swimming in them, met Thorne's. "Make me slave if you must, master." The word was a stone in her throat, but "feed my children first." The plea hung in the air, a raw wound exposed. The children looked up at Thorne, their faces a mixture of fear and a desperate, uncomprehending hope. The crowd shifted, a collective murmur of discomfort, but no one moved, no one spoke. They were sheep, and Thorne was the wolf, and this was merely the way of the world. In the shadow of the blacksmith's lean-to, a man stood apart. Silas. His face was weathered leather, creased by sun and a sorrow that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in the lines around his eyes. He was built like an oak, solid and unyielding, his hands, calloused and capable, resting by his sides. He'd seen auctions before, cattle mostly, sometimes land. Never souls. Not like this. His gaze, the color of a winter sky, was fixed not on Thorne, nor even entirely on Ilara, but on the small, frightened faces of her children. A muscle twitched in his jaw, a barely perceptible tightening. Thorne savored the moment, his smile widening. "A touching sentiment. Perhaps your willingness might be worth a crust or two for the brats." He took a step forward, his shadow falling over Ilara and her children. Just as he was about to speak again, to seal their fate with his vile pronouncement, a voice, low and gravelly as a riverbed, sliced through the tension. "What's the debt?" Silas had moved, not quickly, but with a sureness that drew every eye. He now stood at the edge of the small clearing before the steps, his presence a sudden, unexpected impediment. Thorne, startled, turned. "And who, by the saints, are you to ask?" he sneered, disdain dripping from every syllable. Silas didn't answer the question directly. His eyes, cold and steady, met Thorne's. "The woman. Her children. What's the price for their burden?" The word burden was spoken with a quiet contempt that Thorne, insulated by his arrogance, almost missed. It was not a challenge, not yet, but it was a question Thorne hadn't anticipated, an interruption to his cruel theater. The air crackled, the dust motes dancing in the sudden, sharp silence that followed. The tableau was broken, a new player had entered the scene, and the price was no longer just about money. Thorne's face, moments before suffused with smug triumph, began to mottle with anger. "The price is her servitude, farmer. Long and hard. Something a man like you wouldn't understand." He looked Silas up and down, taking in the worn dungarees, the patched shirt, the aura of isolation that clung to him like the dust of his lonely ranch. "They are mine, by law." Silas's gaze didn't waver. "The law's got ears for coin." "How much coin, Thorne?" He took another step, slow, deliberate, closing the distance by a fraction. His hand drifted, almost imperceptibly, towards the worn Colt peacemaker holstered low on his hip, a gesture not of threat, but of unconscious readiness, like a carpenter reaching for a familiar tool. Ilara watched, a new kind of fear blooming in her heart, sharper and more immediate than the dread Thorn inspired. This stranger, this quiet, sun-burnished man, was he offering a different kind of damnation? Her children, sensing the shift in tension, pressed closer against her, the boy's small hand finding hers. Thorn scoffed, a harsh, barking sound. "More than you've seen in a lifetime, hayseed. She owes me $200 for her husband's worthless investments, plus interest, plus the cost of my time." He waved a dismissive hand. "Go back to your pigs." But Silas did not move. From an inner pocket of his vest, he produced a worn leather pouch. The sound it made when he tossed it onto the dusty planks of the mercantile steps was a solid, undeniable thud. Not the jingle of a few coins, but the heavy promise of substance. "Count it," Silas said, his voice still low, yet it carried an undeniable authority. Thorn stared at the pouch as if it were a coiled rattler. His men, brutish and slow-witted, looked from Silas to Thorn, confusion clouding their faces. The crowd held its breath. Slowly, Thorn bent and picked up the pouch. His fingers, usually so quick to grasp, fumbled with the drawstring. Gold coins spilled into his palm, glinting dully in the oppressive sunlight. He counted, his lips moving silently. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a frustrated rage. It was all there, perhaps even a little more. This doesn't change the principle of the thing," Thorn blustered, but the conviction was draining from his voice. "She still has a debt to society, to me." Silas's eyes narrowed. "The debt is paid. The woman and her children are free to go." He didn't raise his voice, but the finality in his tone was absolute. He looked at Ilara. "Get your children." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. "Freedom? Just like that?" From the cruel sneer of Thorn to the impenetrable gaze of this stranger. She felt a tremor run through her thin frame, a visible ripple of mixed fear and dawning, fragile hope. She hesitated, her eyes darting between Thorn, sputtering with impotent fury, and Silas, who stood like a rock against a storm. Who are you?" she whispered, the question barely audible. Silas's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it rested on her and the children. "Name Silas. And I reckon you and your young uns need a safe place for a spell." He gestured with his head towards the edge of town, where a weathered buckboard and a sturdy mare stood waiting, as if he'd anticipated this outcome all along. "My ranch ain't much, but it's quiet. And there's food." Thorn, clutching the gold, looked like he might explode. "You haven't heard the last of this, farmer. Nobody makes a fool of Jedediah Thorn." But Silas merely turned his back on him, a dismissal more profound than any insult, and waited for Ilara. She rose, pulling her children close, their small hands gripping hers tightly. With one last, frightened glance at the seething Thorn, she walked towards Silas, towards an unknown future that could hardly be worse than the one she had just escaped. The journey to Silas's homestead was made in a silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional soft sigh from one of the children, who, exhausted by fear and hunger, eventually drifted into a troubled sleep. Ilara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, stealing glances at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the setting sun, his hands sure on the reins. He offered no conversation, no explanation for his extraordinary intervention. Was he a savior or merely a different kind of captor? The thought chilled her, even as the evening air grew cool. The town's whispers would follow them, she knew, whispers of Thorn's fury and the stranger's audacity. Sheriff Brody, a man whose conscience was often stretched thin between the letter of the law and the clout of men like Thorn, would surely be watching, wondering. As they crested a small rise, a homestead came into view, a simple, sturdy cabin, a barn, and fenced corrals, all nestled in a shallow valley. It was isolated, starkly beautiful in the fading light. And there, on a gentle slope overlooking the cabin, Ilara saw them, two small, weathered wooden crosses. Silas didn't look towards them, but Ilara felt a sudden, sharp understanding, a premonition of the sorrow that shaped the man beside her. Life at Silas's ranch settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. He was a man of few words, rising before dawn and working until dusk, his movements economical and purposeful. He'd shown Elara the small, clean room that would be hers and the children's, pointed out the well, the vegetable patch, the smokehouse. "There's food in the pantry. Take what you need for the young uns," he'd said, his voice devoid of inflection, yet not unkind. Elara, accustomed to harsh words and harsher demands, found his quiet reticence unnerving. She cooked and cleaned, mended the children's tattered clothes, and helped in the garden, trying to earn her keep, to demonstrate she was not a burden. She expected orders, criticisms, the casual cruelty she had come to associate with any man who held power over her. But Silas merely observed, his gaze thoughtful, sometimes distant, as if he were looking through her at something far away. The children, Pip and Lily, were initially timid, shadows clinging to Elara's skirts. But children are resilient. Lily, emboldened by hunger and a child's simple trust, was the first to approach Silas, offering him a wilted prairie flower. Silas had stopped his work, mending a harness, and looked down at the tiny offering in her grubby hand. For a moment, Elara held her breath. Then, Silas's large, calloused fingers had gently taken the flower, his expression unreadable. He'd tucked it into the band of his hat, where it stayed for the rest of the day, a splash of incongruous color against his somber attire. Pip, more cautious, watched Silas from a distance, but his eyes followed the man's every move. One afternoon, Silas sat on the porch steps, carving a piece of scrap wood. Pip edged closer, drawn by the flash of the knife and the emerging shape. Without a word, Silas finished carving a small, rough horse and held it out. Pip hesitated, then snatched it, a rare smile illuminating his thin face before he scurried away to show Lily. Elara saw it all, and a knot of confusion and a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, something akin to gratitude, tightened in her chest. Meanwhile, in the town of Redemption, Jedediah Thorne was not idle. His public humiliation festered, his wounded pride demanding vengeance. He gathered his hard cases, men loyal to his coin and his cruelty, their whispers painting Silas as a fool, an outlaw, a man who had stolen Thorne's rightful property. Sheriff Brody paid a visit to the ranch one sweltering afternoon. He was a tall, stooped man, his badge dulled with age and compromise. "Silas," he began, accepting a dipper of water, Thorne stirring up trouble. "Says you stole that woman and her children. Says you threatened him." Silas continued sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel the only sound for a moment. "Debt was paid, Brody." "You know," Thorne, Brody sighed, wiping his brow. "I know. But he's got influence. He's talking about forming a posse, claiming you're harboring fugitives. It ain't right, but he can make it ugly." He looked towards the cabin, where Elara was hanging out laundry, the children playing nearby. "Those young uns, they remind a man of what's important." Silas stopped his work. "They're safe here for now," Brody said, his gaze grave. "Be careful, Silas. Thorne's a snake, and he's been stepped on." That evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, mirroring the turmoil in their lives, Elara found Silas staring out at the two small graves on the hillside. The wind whipped his hair, and his face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a mask of such profound grief that Elara felt an ache in her own heart. She had seen him glance that way before, but never with such naked sorrow. Hesitantly, she approached. "Mr. Silas?" He didn't turn. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar with sharing such burdens. "And my children. Martha and Caleb. Fever took him." Same winter. The words were stark, like the crosses themselves. Elara stood beside him, the wind tearing at her dress. She understood now. The haunted eyes, the quiet protection, the immediate empathy for her own children's plight. It wasn't charity, it was a shared wound, a recognition of a pain too deep for words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Silas finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not a master, not a captor, but a fellow traveler in a landscape of loss. "They deserve to be safe," he said, his gaze shifting to where Pip and Lily slept inside the cabin. All children do in that moment, the last vestiges of Ilara's fear of him dissolved, replaced by a profound, sorrowful understanding, and a dawning loyalty to this broken, honorable man. The storm inside Silas, she realized, was far greater than the one brewing in the sky. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Jedediah Thorne was the lightning that would inevitably strike. The storm broke the following day, not with rain and thunder, but with the drumming of hooves and the glint of rifle barrels in the harsh midday sun. Thorne, flanked by a half-dozen of his most brutal cronies, rode into Silas's yard, their faces set in expressions of grim anticipation. They found out, a loose cordon around the cabin, cutting off any escape. "Silas!" Thorne's voice was a venomous roar. "I've come for what's mine. Send out the woman and her brats, and I might just let you live, squatter." Inside the cabin, Ilara grabbed Pip and Lily, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stay down and stay quiet," she whispered, ushering them under the sturdy wooden table in the corner, her body a shield. Silas had been expecting them. He stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, not aiming, but ready. His face was calm, his eyes cold and watchful. "They're not yours, Thorne. The debt was paid. You've got no claim. My claim is what I say it is." Thorne spat, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You interfered in my business, made me a laughingstock. Now you pay." One of Thorne's men, eager to impress, raised his rifle. "Let's just take boss." Before Thorne could answer, Silas's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. "First man to make a move on that cabin answers to me." There was no bluster in his tone, only a chilling certainty. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. Silas knew this was not a fight he could win with numbers, only with resolve and a desperate courage born of past losses. He was one man against 7, but he was defending more than just a piece of land. He was defending the flicker of hope he'd seen in the children's eyes, the fragile chance at a life Ilara deserved. The standoff stretched, taut and brittle. Then, Thorne, his patience exhausted, snarled, "Take him." The first shot came from Thorne's side, kicking up dust near Silas's feet. And then the world exploded into chaos. Silas dropped to one knee, firing not wildly, but with a deadly precision that spoke of a past he never discussed. One of Thorne's men cried out, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. Ilara, peeking through a crack in the shutters, saw Silas move with a fluid grace that belied his size, using the porch posts for cover, his shots methodical. He wasn't a rancher playing at soldier, he was a man who knew the grim dance of death. Another of Thorne's men went down, a cry cut short. Fear began to eat at the edges of Thorne's bravado. He'd expected a quick, brutal resolution, not this sustained, effective resistance. "Burn him out!" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking. A flaming torch arced towards the cabin, landing on the dry porch roof. Smoke began to curl upwards. Panic seized Ilara. Not for herself, but for Pip and Lily, coughing as the smoke began to seep into the cabin. She had to do something. Grabbing a heavy iron skillet, she flung open the cabin door just as one of Thorne's men, emboldened by the fire, rushed the porch. With a desperate cry, she swung the skillet, connecting with the side of his head. He stumbled back, stunned, giving Silas the fraction of a second he needed to aim and fire. The man crumpled. But the fire was spreading. Silas knew he couldn't hold out much longer. He was bleeding from a graze on his arm, the smoke stinging his eyes. Just as Thorne and his remaining men prepared for a final, overwhelming rush, a new sound split the air, the sharp crack of a different rifle, followed by a commanding shout. "Thorne! Hold your fire! This is Sheriff Brody! Drop your weapons, now!" Sheriff Brody, with 2 newly deputized townsmen, rode hard into the yard, their guns leveled. Thorne, caught between Silas's deadly rifle and the law, hesitated, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Brody! This ain't your concern. He stole my property." "Your property?" Brody's voice was laced with contempt. "I saw the bill of sale for that debt, Thorne, pushed through by your bully boys. And I saw Silas pay it fair and square. What I see now is attempted murder and arson. He gestured with his rifle. It's over. Thorne's men, their stomach for a fight against the law less than their appetite for bullying the helpless, began to lower their guns. Thorne, however, remained defiant for a moment longer, his eyes burning with hatred as he stared at Silas. Then, seeing the resolve in Brody's face, and the grim determination of Silas, who still had him in his sights, Thorne's shoulders slumped. He let his gun fall to the dust. The fight was over. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire on the porch roof, quickly being doused by Brody's men, and Lily's soft crying from inside the cabin. The aftermath hung heavy in the smoky air, the scent of gunpowder mingling with the charred wood of the porch. Silas, his arm hastily bandaged by Elara with a strip torn from her petticoat, watched as Sheriff Brody and his deputies secured Thorne and his remaining men. Thorne, his arrogance shattered, was reduced to a sullen, muttering captive, his threats now empty bluster. "He tried to kill us, Sheriff," Elara said, her voice trembling but firm, Pip and Lily clinging to her skirts, their small faces smudged with soot and fear, but their eyes fixed on Silas with a new, unwavering awe. "I know," Brody said, his gaze resting on Silas with a grudging respect. "We got witness testimony from folks in town who saw Thorne rile up this mob. His days of terrorizing redemption are done. The circuit judge is due next month. He'll see Thorne gets what's coming to him." Brody looked at the damage to the cabin, the bullet holes scarring the walls. "Silas, you did what any decent man would. You protected your own." Silas merely nodded, his eyes on the children. The word "own" resonated deep within him. He hadn't thought of it that way, not consciously. He had acted out of a raw, undeniable instinct, a need to shield innocence from the very darkness that had once consumed his own life. As Brody led the prisoners away, a quiet settled over the ranch, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft whisper of the wind through the tall grass. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind an exhaustion that was more than just physical. Elara busied herself tending to Silas's wound more thoroughly, her touch surprisingly gentle. The children, their fear slowly receding, sat on the porch steps, Pip clutching the small wooden horse Silas had carved, Lily humming softly to her corn-husk doll. That evening, they shared a simple meal of stew and freshly baked bread. The silence around the table was different now, no longer strained or uneasy, but comfortable, filled with unspoken understandings. Silas watched Pip trying to mimic the way he held his spoon, so Lily sneak a piece of bread to the scruffy ranch dog that had adopted them. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years, thawing the frozen landscape of his grief. He looked at Elara, her face softened in the lamplight, the lines of fear and hardship eased, if only for a moment. She met his gaze, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. Later, as the stars blazed in the vast, dark sky, Silas walked to the two small crosses on the hillside. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He stood there for a long time, not in agonizing sorrow, but in a quiet contemplation. The ghosts of Sarah, Martha, and Caleb were still with him, but their presence was no longer a crushing weight. It was as if, by saving Elara and her children, he had somehow honored the love he still bore for his lost family, reaffirming the preciousness of life itself. He wasn't replacing them, he knew that. But the hollow ache in his soul felt a little less vast, a little less empty. He had faced down his past, not by forgetting it, but by allowing its lessons of love and loss to fuel a future he hadn't dared to imagine. He had been a protector once more, and in doing so, he had begun to protect himself from the consuming shadows. Redemption. It wasn't just the name of a dusty town. It was a path, hard-fought and dearly won, a journey from the abyss towards a new dawn. Looking back at the warm glow of light spilling from the cabin window, where Elara was tucking her children into bed, Silas felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a very long time, a fragile, tentative hope. The fight for survival had ended, the journey towards healing had just begun. This solitary ranch, once a monument to his grief, now held the possibility of becoming a home once more. What makes a man step out of the shadows, to risk everything for strangers? Is it the memory of his own pain, or the stubborn spark of decency that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times? If you stood in Silas's worn boots that day in the town square, watching a mother's desperate plea, what choice would you have made? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption from the heart of the West.